Mr. Green has written for many leading publications in US and Europe, including The New Yorker, The Fortune, Forbes, Bloomberg Market, the Los Angeles Times, the Boston Globe magazine, and The Economist. He has interviewed presidents and prime ministers, inventors, criminals, prize-winning authors, CEOs of some large companies in the world, and countless billionaires. In Richer, Wiser, Happier, William draws on interviews that he has conducted over 25 years with many of the world's greatest investors. As he discovered, their talents extend well beyond finance and are more about practical philosophy. Green ushers us into the lives of more than 40 super investors through his book, visiting them in their offices, homes, and even their places of worship, all to share what they have to teach us. This book brings together the thinking of many of the greatest investors' mind, like Sir John Templeton to Charlie Munger, Jack Bogle to Ed Thorpe, Will Danoff to Mohnish Pabrai, Joel Greenwald to Howard Marks. In explaining how they think and why they win, this landmark book gives gems of insights that will enrich us financially, not only financially, but also professionally and personally. It teaches us how to think better, invest better, and possibly live better. Sir, we at Millennium Mams, our 400 plus members, all are reading your book. And we have gifted, yes. And
I apologize in advance then.
Oh, please. And we have gifted more than 150 copies of this book. Wow, so this is our way to tell you how much we love and appreciate this book. Welcome to our forum, William.
Thank you.
Welcome
that's lovely. I'm very touched. That's lovely. And it may sound like I'm just saying that, but when you said that, I came up in chills. So that's very nice. One of the lovely things about writing this book is that writing the book wasn't lovely at all. It was very painful and very challenging, as anyone who writes will know. But seeing it spread around the world has been an amazing thing, and it's being translated into something like 22 languages at the moment, including, I think, Hindu, Gujarati, and Maharashtra. And you have to apologize if I'm making terrible mistakes with my pronunciation.
That's okay.
So seeing it spread in India, in particular, has been a really amazing and wonderful thing. And I think partly because I've spent time, not a huge amount of time, but I came to India. The very first thing I did for this book was I came to India for 5 days with Mohnish and traveled. And when I was editing the Asian edition of Time magazine, I went to India to interview Prime Minister Manmohan Singh, and I was friends for a long time. I hired Aravind Adiga, the novelist who wrote The White Tiger, and I convinced him to move to India when he was living in New York. So I went and hung out with Aravind in India. So I have particularly fond memories of my trips to India. So watching it spread there has been wonderful.
William, yeah. I take this opportunity to invite you once again to India, to our forum.
I would love to.
Yes.
That would
any
be
of the places you
honor.
wish, Kolkata, Mumbai, Bangalore, anywhere you wish, we all will be there to meet you.
Oh, well, that's great. That will be an honor. I'll look forward to it. Thank you.
Yes, please. Whenever you come to India, please keep in touch with us.
Okay, great. Well, thank you. And so I feel like I've hijacked you by taking off in a different direction. And so feel free to ask whatever questions you have on your mind.
So now I invite my committee member, Meghna Bajoria, to take this session forward.
Great.
Thank you. Thank you, Preeti. Hi. Hello, William. It's such an honor to have you here with us. For me, this book truly brought out a analogy of how to be a true investor, a value investor. The way you describe the mindset of these extraordinary investors, not just regarding investment, but also about life, was brilliant. Our members here have a whole lot of questions for you. Before I call upon them, it would be great if you can tell us first a little bit about your journey and how you came about writing this phenomenal book.
Thank you. Well, part of what happened is when I was young, I grew up in London, and my father was a judge, and my mother is a very formidable woman. She is a housewife who clearly was always the smartest person in my family. And my father got a scholarship to Oxford and was a very brilliant man. But there was no question that my mum was the formidable person. And in fact, every chapter of my book, the first person I sent every chapter to was my mother, not my editor. And so I grew up in this very literate family with my father used to sit around reading the Oxford English Dictionary for pleasure, and studied ancient Greek for pleasure in his 70s. And my mother was super literate and was a wonderful storyteller. And so I always assumed I would tell stories and I would be a writer. And so I went to Oxford and I studied English literature. And I moved to New York in my early 20s and started writing for English magazines, mainly things like The Spectator, writing about books. And I thought I was going to be a great novelist or something very literate. And literally, when I got the New York Times in the city every morning, I would throw out the business section without even looking at it. I thought money and business was kind of vulgar, and people who devoted themselves to making money were kind of crass and superficial. And then in my mid-20s, my brother and I sold an apartment that we'd owned in London. And property then in London wasn't that valuable. But I had this windfall that wasn't huge, but I had to actually figure out what to do with it. And so I started studying the stock market. And I just loved the game of it. I think partly because I'm just naturally lazy. And I thought this is the most amazing thing where you can make money just by thinking. And to some degree, that's turned out to be true, that it is a game where I do think you have to work hard. But it's a wonderful thing that you can be a lazy, sedentary person like me who just, I mean, you can see my bookshelf here, right? Which looks like it's going to fall down. If I tip this up further, you can see it kind of goes to the sky. My idea of heaven is to sit around reading and thinking and talking. And here was this game where you could just make money by thinking. And I thought that was the most wonderful thing. And so I became kind of obsessed with it, to my surprise. But then what was amazing was that I could actually interview these great investors because I was a writer. And so I was working for Forbes and Money Magazine and Fortune and later Time Magazine. And so I would go interview someone like Sir John Templeton. I'd convince him to host me for a day in the Bahamas, and I'd go interview him about the principles of investing. This guy who is, I think, probably 86 at the time and was the greatest global stock picker of the 20th century. And so the book grew out of those experiences. So even when I was editing the Asian edition of Time Magazine and I was crazily busy and was covering politics and business and literature and the arts, I still would occasionally write a column. I wrote a column, a global markets column, where I went to India at one point during a period where it was very bubbly in India, the market, and wrote a column about that. Sorry, say again. And so I just so I kept up that obsession, and the book grew out of that. That gradually I thought, well, I've learned how to play the game from these people, but what I've also discovered is they're unbelievable thinkers. And what if I could share the most important ideas I've learned from them, not only about actually how to invest, but about how to think? Because if you look at people like Charlie Munger, Buffett's 98-year-old polymathic genius partner, he's obsessed with this question of worldly wisdom, which is a phrase I think he got from John Maynard Keynes, of not just how to invest, but actually how to live, what constitutes a successful life, how you should be ethical, how you should be less stupid, things like that. And I just thought, wow, they're almost like practical philosophers, because they're dealing with these very practical questions, like, how do you make decisions when the future is unknowable? If none of us know the future, and the Buddhists are correct, which I think they are, that everything changes, that everything is in a constant state of flux. nothing stays the same, and the future is unknowable, then how do you make a decision? And you can't ask a journalist like me how to do that, but you can ask a billionaire who has an enormous amount of money riding on the decision, because they're going to really think through that question. So there's something about having skin in the game that forces people to become extraordinarily good thinkers. So they became a kind of filter for how to view the world. So that was my goal, was to share everything, to share and kind of synthesize for myself everything that I'd learned from 25 years of interviewing these people.
Wow, that was fascinating, William. Thank you for sharing. I'd like to now call upon Nidhi for the next question, please.
Thank you.
Good morning, William.
Morning.
William, you just mentioned about you being lazy. In another context, Mr. Dhanuka also believes in the concept of do nothing, basically making the bets and investments when the time is right. So what would you say has been your experience, your personal experience, as well as from all your interviews?
There's a really beautiful image that that Charlie Munger has of being like a spear fisherman as an investor. And what Charlie said is that you should basically be standing by the side of a stream with your spear, waiting for a fat, juicy salmon to swim by. Once in a while, this fat, juicy salmon is going to swim by and you spear it. And then you go back to sitting on your hands for the next 6 months, 2 years, 5 years, whatever it might be. And so when Monish Pabrai started to study investing and obsessively reverse engineering what Buffett and Munger did, he starts looking at all of these other investors and he says, it's unbelievable. None of them understand the game and none of them play it this way. So in Monish's very colorful language, he would say, I could see they're all absolutely hosed. You know, I would look at these professional investors and they have 200 stocks. They're trading the whole time. They're overpriced stocks. On what possible basis do they think they can find 200 stocks that are going to double? So what Monish figured out is, I want to be like that spear fisherman. I want to sit around like a man of letters, reading and thinking, studying different business models, reading annual reports, and then once in a while, a fat, juicy salmon is going to swim by and I'm going to seize it. And that to me is a very beautiful idea, that it's a strange game where you're not paid for hyperactivity. You're paid for being right and for being extremely selective and extremely patient.
Yes.
And so in a culture where everyone is moving fast and everyone is short term, you have this elite group of people who have this temperamental advantage that enables them to sit around very peacefully, very calmly, very dispassionately, and wait for the fat, juicy salmon. And then once they find it, they tend to keep it for many years. And I think that's a profound lesson, not only about investing, but about life. That the more short term and impatient most people get, the more they're focused on the little dopamine hit, the little rush of checking their Twitter messages, checking their email, texting, checking their WhatsApp, reading the latest news. The more it's a competitive advantage for this tiny minority that can shift towards long-term behavior. And this to me is very fascinating, because I spend a lot of time reading about philosophy and spirituality and the like. One of the things that I study is Kabbalah, which is this ancient form of Jewish mysticism, where one of the most central tenets is this idea of deferred gratification, where what you're saying is, okay, so my nature might be to lose my temper, or to be impatient, or to eat 3 donuts, or whatever it might be, or it might be not to speak up when someone is unpleasant to me. We each have a different type of makeup. That what the Kabbalists would say is, you want to restrict that. You go against your nature. And so this ability to defer gratification turns out to be a master principle in life. You go back to the Old Testament and you see Joseph becoming the second most powerful person in Egypt by setting aside grain during the 7 fat years for the 7 lean years. You see the story of the selling of the birthright for a bowl of lentil soup, which is a perfect example of instant gratification. So I think since the beginning of time, we've known this to our core, that the ability to defer gratification and to move slowly and patiently through life instead of in a hurry and superficially and shallowly and hyperactively. It's just it's a much better model. So this is actually, it's not just a way of investing, it's actually a way of living. And so I think what you want to do throughout your life is to say, when everyone else is going shallow and quick, let me go deep. Let me focus on long-term destinations. And I think Munger talks about having the deferred gratification gene, and it's helpful to be wired that way. But I think even knowing that this is an issue is very helpful, because once you're aware of it, you don't feel you have to be hyperactive. So I have for example, I'm close friends with Guy Spear, who runs the Aquamarine Fund.
Mhm.
And I invested in the fund more than 20 years ago. And I've said to him, this is a 40-year investment. And I'm in a share class that's a 5-year share class. You know, I pay no fee. And I pay there's an incentive fee. So he doesn't get paid unless he performs. But it's a 5-year lockup. So I'm actually pushing myself to be inactive. And likewise, I own 3 stocks, one of which is Berkshire Hathaway. And I've made a mistake with 2 of the stocks. 2 of the stocks are not doing particularly well. One of them is Alibaba, which Charlie owns. And I'm thinking, well, should I sell it? I don't really know what I'm doing. Why should I own an individual stock? And I'm like, no, I'm not allowed to sell for 5 years. And so I'm kind of forcing myself to be long-term. So the more that you can push yourself to focus on long-term destinations, I think the better you'll do, especially in this shallow, superficial, hyperactive culture that we're living in at the moment. But it requires real discipline to understand, oh, that's how the game's played.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Really, really insightful.
Thanks for the
And we have
question.
Vasundhara Pasari for the next question, please.
Thank you.
Good morning, sir. So in your
Morning.
book, you mentioned that there are several ways of winning, but they all require having an edge, some form of an edge. So, sir, could you tell us a few ways of acquiring this edge over the others?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. It's a very good question. Well, there's the edge that comes from someone like Peter Lynch, who became a legendary investor over 13 years, who just said, I'm never going to stop working. When Bill Miller went to see him early in his career for advice, Peter Lynch said to him, there's basically only one gear. You have to go full speed ahead. I love that picture behind you. That's beautiful. Sorry, I'm distracted. That's lovely. And he said he never took a vacation. He carpooled at 6:30 in the morning so that he could read research reports in the morning. And he worked at the weekend. And he said, basically, look, all the people in this business are really smart and you have to outwork them. So there's an intensity to the greatest investors that they're almost fanatical. And I suspect that's the case with most people who are at the very, very top of every game. And I don't think that's necessary for most of us. But you'd be lying if you didn't say that they were fanatical. I mean, I remember Paul Launces saying to me, you don't get to be Roger Federer without playing tennis. And so these guys work maniacally hard in many cases, but it's paradoxical because they're not necessarily doing that much. They're not necessarily making a lot of bets. But what Lynch would say is he was turning over a lot of rocks. So if he's looking at 100 companies, maybe he finds one that he loves. and that makes all the difference. So there's just the sheer intensity, the ferocity of focus is helpful. That's one edge. There's an intellectual edge. Some of these guys are just really, really smart. But I would say the most enduring edges probably turn out to be temperamental. It's the ability to be patient, to be calm, to be unemotional in a market where everyone else is being overly emotional. So to sit there dispassionately by the stream, waiting for the juicy salmon. So that temperamental advantage, the emotional advantage is huge. And the other thing which is related is it's time, it's patience, it's having a long-term destination. So I had a conversation with Guy Spear, who I mentioned a minute ago, that's coming up on my podcast, where we were talking about his generational focus. He's talking about how his great-grandparents were very wealthy business people in Germany before World War II and had all of their money confiscated by the Nazis and fled with nothing to various countries around the world. And he's gradually rebuilt his family's fortune. He's thinking in generational terms. And so he invests in companies like he owns Indian Energy Exchange because he's thinking, well, India has challenges with its power. Here's a company that provides an extraordinary service. It's the economic high ground because it enables India to address this long-term issue. It's well managed. I'm not saying this is a recommendation. I'm just saying this is the way that he's thinking. He's not looking to trade in and out. And in fact, we were talking about the fact that one of the biggest mistakes of his career is I think he bought Crystal many years ago and he made 5 times his money, and for various reasons he sold it, and he said, look, I would have made 100 times my money if I had kept that. And so it's finding this economic high ground and staying there. And so that ability to be patient and long-term and calm and unemotional, I think that's an achievable edge. I am never going to be as smart as Bill Miller. I'm just not. He's got 30, 40, 50 extra IQ points, but I can be patient. And so just to push yourself to say, what's the long-term destination here? And so, for example, in a difficult market like we've had here, particularly in US tech stocks and cryptocurrencies and the like, just I look at this stuff and I look each day. I own a hedge fund that's somewhat racy just because it's very highly concentrated in about 12 stocks. And I got my monthly statement the other day, and you look at it and you're like, wow, that's a lot that's down. I think it's down 37% this year. You look at it and you're like, well, that's okay, because I've already been in it for several years and I plan to own it for many years, and I'll keep adding to it. And it gives you a level of peace to know that this is a long-term game. I hope that helps to put it in perspective.
Thank you so much.
And think of Warren and Charlie. In my new interview with Monish that just came out on the Richer, Wiser, Happier podcast, which I think he was on very fine form. He says some really powerful and beautiful things in that. He talks about how Warren and Charlie really just think about the future. They're not looking back and resting on their laurels. So here you have a 98-year-old and a 91-year-old. So it's at 189 years between them, and they're focused on the future. And so you want to be building something for the long term. And that's just a tremendous competitive advantage in a short-term world.
Thank you, sir.
Can we have Kunti for the next question, please?
Hello, William.
Hi.
Hi. We're very happy to have you on this forum, and I'm sure after this session, we'll also be richer and wiser. My question to you, William,
too,
is
I hope.
Yes, and happier. We are happy to have you here anyway.
Thank you.
Yeah. So my question to you, William, is of all these rich elite investors that you have interviewed, who did you personally find happiest and wisest? And could you elaborate why?
Well, I was pretty selective in who I wrote about. So there are certain people who are incredibly successful, rich investors who I think are probably kind of not admirable human beings. And I just didn't want to write about those people. Just the fact that someone is able to make enormous amounts of money doesn't necessarily mean that they're someone you would want to clone. So people who'd left a trail of destruction, suing their partners, cheating people, just generally being snakes, I just wasn't very interested in them. So most of the people I write about, pretty much all are people that I admire and like a great deal. But there are certain people who I would say it's really stood out. So people that comes to mind, someone like Ed Thorpe, someone like Tom Gaynor, Arnold Vandenberg, Joe Greenblatt. They all go through difficulties. They've all had hard times, I'm sure, and challenges. But I would say Monish as well has had difficult times, went through a divorce and the like, but he's kind of irrepressibly optimistic and cheerful. And so just very resilient. And so there's a common denominator with all of these people, various common denominators. One of them is that they're very sharing. And so I think there's something to that. It's not just that Monish is really good at making these bets, these infrequent bets, while sitting quietly in a room on his own. He's done this extraordinary thing in creating Dakshana, this charity that's lifting tens of thousands of very bright, very underprivileged families out of poverty. And that gives him tremendous joy and satisfaction. I remember, because I started the book by going with Monish to various schools around the country. And Monish is a very rich guy who has his Ferrari or whatever. I think he may have got rid of his Ferrari, but he's got, these fancy clothes. And I remember at one point hearing, a friend of his told me, yeah, I think Monish just spent like $6,000 on a pair of shoes. So it's not like Monish has taken a vow of poverty. He lives very well, but he doesn't intend to end his life with any of his money. He's giving it all away to lift other people out of poverty. And so it's all a game for Monish. It's not about just being the flashiest, richest guy. And so I think that element of sharing has been absolutely key. And that's why I end the book with Arnold Vandenberg as well, that when you look at Arnold, there's something very extraordinary about his irrepressible desire to help other people. I mean, he literally, he hypnotized me on the floor of his office in Austin, Texas, when I went to interview him for 2.5 days for the book, because he thought the way that I talk to myself and is too negative, and that he needs to kind of change my inner landscape so that I'm giving myself different messages. Because what he said to me is, look, it's like it's like a radio with distortion. It can't, you've been really pretty successful with all this distortion in your head. What if you could clear it and your subconscious, and your subconscious was working to your benefit? And so one of the things, I'd encourage you to listen to the episode where I talked to Arnold, because he gives some very specific advice on how to do this. And I include in the show notes various books that he recommended. But I can't tell you the pleasure he got out of trying to help me. And then he would do things like he'd send me a trampoline because he was worried that I'm too lazy and sedentary. And so he often, when you're on the phone to him, he's on his trampoline. This 81-year-old, I think maybe 82 now, 82-year-old guy on his trampoline as he's on his phone talking to you from his office. So he's keeping really active. So I think there's something really valuable in reverse engineering the people who are happiest and thinking, yeah, there's sharing built in. It's not just about them. We know this concept of the hedonic treadmill, right? Where it's just, you're a hedonist just trying to get more. It just doesn't work. It's not that it's immoral necessarily. It's not immoral not to be, well, it can be immoral not to defer gratification, but it just doesn't work. And what Charlie says is I observe what works and doesn't work and why. And so when I observe what makes these people happiest, I'm struck again and again by that sharing. And I'll give you one beautiful example of it that isn't in the book, which is I became a senior advisor to an investment firm in New York, and they asked me if I could interview a great investor at their offsite. And so there were only about 35 people there, and they're very good investors, very smart people. But it's kind of embarrassing. I'm going to ask a famous investor to come so I can interview them privately for 35 people at a company's offsite. What's in it for them? So I asked Tom Gaynor, and because Tom is just a really lovely human being. Tom gets a train from Virginia to New York, a 6-hour train, doesn't fly on a private jet or anything, literally gets a train for 6 hours. He said, no, I don't want to do it over Zoom, because he said, I think there'll be better energy if I'm there with you in person. So the co-CEO of a company, I mean, I love Zoom, so I'm happy to be here with you, but he said that here's a guy, the co-CEO of a Fortune 400 company with something like 17,000 employees and 19 private companies managing more than $20 billion. And he takes a 6-hour train ride to do a 1-hour, we had dinner together with the people from this firm. And then the next morning I interviewed him for an hour. That's just such an incredibly kind thing to do. There's nothing in it for him, just decency. But if you think about the way that he's living his life, he's just surrounded by people who wish him well and want to help him. And so I talk about this in the chapter on high performance habits, this idea of compounding goodwill. And initially, for someone like my friend Guy Spear, it started as a kind of slightly strategic scheming thing where he thought, well, I know from reading Robert Cialdini that there's this reciprocation bias, where if you help someone, they're going to reciprocate. So he said, it's going to benefit me if I'm nice to everyone. But at a certain point, you see it becoming addictive because you're surrounded by people who you're helping and who wish you well. And so something like this, look, it's for me to get up to talk to all of you at 7:30 in the morning. What could be a greater joy? Absolutely. I mean, really, it's if I can help in any way, that's really fun. So who's the real recipient here? You know, I hope you all get something out of it, but I get something out of it because I feel happy trying to share some ideas that could be helpful. And so I think that's something that, because all of the great investors are these great pragmatists, they look at what works and they just say, oh yeah, if I want a happy life, I better share more. I better try to be more decent. I better try to compound goodwill. I better try to be kinder. And so that to me is very powerful, because it's not like Mother Teresa saying you should be kinder and more loving and more charitable. I mean, that's wonderful, but she's a saint. This is a bunch of billionaires or centimillionaires saying this works. And you look at that and you can say in a very unsentimental way, it works. And I was very struck. I talk about this with Monish in the episode of my podcast with Monish. I was very struck by how much he's changed in recent years, right? I can see that he's kinder and gentler. I can see the progress he's made in becoming a better and better human being. And I think that's because he's been hanging out with Charlie and Warren. It's really interesting to see the impact of good behavior. So one of the things that you want to do is be very thoughtful about this question of who you're hanging out with. As Warren said to Guy and Monish when he had their famous charity lunch for something like $650,000 back in 2008, he said, hang out with people who are better than you and you can't help but improve. And so being very thoughtful about your ecosystem is a really profoundly important thing. And you want to hang out with people who bring out the best in you, but you also, like Charlie, you want to hang out with the eminent dead. And so you want to be reading the right things. And so, because I read a lot of philosophical and spiritual books, I would start reading Ramana Maharshi, and I look and I'm like, oh, so, this is someone I want to hang out with. Or I would start reading this great Tibetan Buddhist, Tulku Urgyen Rinpoche, or I would read this great Kabbalist, Rav Ashlag. And I would read Marcus Aurelius's Meditations or Seneca's letters in the same way that Charlie is reading Ben Franklin, because you're hanging out with the eminent dead. And it's funny, I have this huge stack of books here by my desk. This is sort of more my working pile. And I'm happy to see, my daughter, when she came home from college, brought back a couple of books. And one of them is Carl Van Doren's biography of Ben Franklin that she's returning to my office. I love that my 21-year-old daughter is hanging out with the eminent dead. She's hanging out with Ben Franklin. That's great. So this is a very long-winded way to answer your question, but I think understanding that you want to be kinder, that you want to be more sharing, that you want to surround yourself with good people who bring out the best in you. That's something I've really thought a lot about, because I think we all have both sides in us. I mean, I can see that my wife and my mother and my daughter are probably better people than I am, but they all, under certain conditions, can behave pretty poorly. They can all lose their temper or be over emotional or stressed or whatever. I mean, we all have both sides in us, and I think it just tilts the balance if you hang out with people who make you see, yeah, let me be more like her, let me be more like him, and so it's a very good kind of practical hack for how to become a better person, I would say.
Thank you, William, for sharing all this with us. Really
Thanks.
appreciate it, and then this is something we'll keep in mind for always. Thank you.
Thanks. I hope you do a better job of it than me.
Can we have Avina for the next question, please?
Yeah, hello, William.
Hi.
Hi. Your book confirms that you are a propagator of simplicity. You are practicing simplicity in life. But sir, even after knowing this, we are unable to practice. So it looks like a challenge to us. Please guide us how to apply simplicity in all walks of life.
It's a great question. Well, first of all, understanding the importance of simplicity is an amazingly valuable thing. So as with understanding a principle like deferred gratification, or understanding the reality that Buddhists teach that everything changes, once you know that something like sharing and being kinder is a priority, you're like, okay, at least I understand the rules of the game. So the very first thing, you have a big advantage once you know that simplicity is important. And when it comes to investing, part of what happens is that you're dealing with the great investors with these very high intellects, these formidable people who were rewarded at high school and college for being incredibly smart. And so they got into the habit of solving difficult problems and the world congratulating them for it. Their professors, their parents, everyone being so proud of them for solving difficult problems. And in investing, it's, as Charlie says, it's simple, not easy. And so one of the things that fascinated me was when I started writing about Joel Greenblatt, who's a master game player. He's someone who I came to view as a code breaker, a guy who just understands how very complex games how very complex games work and how to win them in a very simple way. What he did is he reduced the entire game of investing to one idea. So what he said, and this is something that he came to by writing several books, by teaching at Columbia Business School for 20 years, and by running an enormously successful investment firm, a hedge fund that made 40% a year over 20 years, which means you turn $1 million into $836 million. So he's the consummate player of this game. And as he's explaining it to his students and his readers, and he writes a book for his 5 children to explain how to invest, he figures out it all comes down to one thing. He said, value a business and buy it for much less than it's worth. And he said, that's it. And so that's an incredibly simple and beautiful idea. Value a business and buy it for much less than it's worth. But it brings up a really interesting problem. which is, well, do you actually know how to value a business?
Yes.
Do you actually care about valuing businesses? Is that actually how you want to spend your time? And one of the great revelations for me is, no, I'm not that interested. I actually don't want to sit around reading annual reports. I'm much more interested in, as you can see, reading. I mean, I look at this, there's a book, Castaneda's Journey, Lawrence Wright, The End of October, The Trail to Kanjiroba, Letting Go, Emotional Alchemy, Teachings on the Path of Trekko, Benjamin Franklin, The Art of Learning, Standing at the Edge by this woman, Joan Halifax, who's a kind of a Zen Buddhist guru. That's the stuff that interests me. I don't want to sit around reading an annual report and trying to figure out whether the company is undervalued. I think that's wonderful if you do, but that's not what excites me. So I have to say, well, I understand the simplicity that I want to buy companies for less than they're worth, but I want to find a money manager who I trust and who's honest and who likes this game and who runs a concentrated fund, because I know that they can't find 200 great stock picks. So I have one fund that I own that has most of its money in the top 10 stocks, but owns about 20, and another that owns about 12 stocks, because I'm like, well, I think they can do that. And then I know also that indexing is an incredibly powerful but simple idea. So I own 2 index funds that I've owned forever, and I just keep adding to them over the years. So again, an incredibly simple idea. So what Jack Bogle said to me many years ago, the founder of Vanguard, is he said, look, I knew from the start, when everybody thought I was an idiot, I knew from the start that this was going to win, that it was going to beat the average money manager, because the power of fees to erode your capital is just enormous. So he would explain, for example, he said, if you take $1 million and you make 10% a year for 30 years, it turns into $17.5 million. Yes. But if your expenses are 1.5% a year, which for many people are higher than that, then you make 10% a year over 30 years. It comes out, I think, at 11.5 million. So you gave up $6 million just by paying 1.5% a year over 30 years. So he said the math was irrefutable. And so there were all of these people criticizing him for being committed to mediocrity. They were like, well, why would you want to be so mediocre? But he said, no. I've seen all of these star fund managers who were these meteors, and then the ashes just floated down to earth so predictably. It happened again and again and again. And it happened to his business very early in his investment career. So he saw it personally. So that, again, is an incredibly simple idea. You take an index fund. For me, I own a US index fund, and I own an international one. And I do this for my wife, and I do it for my kids. And you just keep adding to the pot year after year after year, regardless of what's happening to the market. Or when the market's getting particularly killed, you add more because you know that you want to own more at lower prices. And so that, again, is a very simple idea. And I'm looking for these simple ideas in every area of life. And so I think, because I get confused because I'm reading all of this stuff and then I'm trying to synthesize all of this material, I try to have a few North Stars, a few principles that I'm like, okay, I'm pretty sure this is true. So someone like David Hawkins, who I've read a lot of his books, like things like Power versus Force or Letting Go, he says, simple kindness to oneself and all that lives is the most transformational force of all. So when I'm getting confused, or I'm thinking, I'm Jewish, and so I go to synagogue on a Saturday, but then I arrive late, and then I don't know, should I do this holiday? Should I do that? And I'm always like, I'm not a very good Jew, and I don't know, I don't eat meat, but then I'm like, but I eat fish, and why should fish suffer? And so I get myself into these knots. And I'm like, well, at least if I can try to be kinder, simple kindness to oneself and others. Like if I, or there's a beautiful principle from a great mindfulness and meditation teacher, Sharon Salzberg, who says, let go and begin again with self-compassion. And I say this to my daughter the whole time. So if you're meditating and you lose the breath, you want to let go and begin again with self-compassion. But this applies to everything in life.
Yes.
When you mess up, when you trip, when you do something stupid, let go, begin again with self-compassion. And so that's simple perseverance. So I'm constantly looking for rules that I would say are approximately true on average over time.
Yes.
So if you're incredibly kind and you're incredibly giving, once in a while, you're going to get taken advantage of. Maybe you have a deadbeat family member who exploits your generosity, and you have to say, well, sometimes I can't just be kind, because if I just give, I'm not enabling that person. So this is why when my son says to me, couldn't you just pay this bill? I'm like, maybe I want him to. So I am paying for his ticket to go to London to see his grandmother, because I really want him to see my 84-year-old grandmother, my 84-year-old mother, who's been sort of on her own for a lot of COVID. But, I also want him to learn to save more money and to be more responsible. And maybe he needs to think, well, I don't know if I can afford just to be a teacher in New York City and live on a teacher's salary. Maybe I need to do something more lucrative, or maybe I'm just fine living on a teacher's salary, and that's great, and it's worth the sacrifice because it's so fulfilling. But I want him to think about these questions. So even something like that, being kind, being generous, it's complicated, right? You don't just want to enable people, but knowing that on average over time, if I'm kinder, if I'm more empathetic, if I'm more sharing, I'm going to draw better people into my life, and I'm going to be happier. That's a very useful, simple rule. So for me, it's like a joke. My wall has all of these Post-its on it that are just reminders to myself of these simple rules. So if I look here's one. It just says, just sitting in the fluidity without judging. So this is something from a great Tibetan Buddhist teacher. So because I'm kind of anxious and my mind is all over the place, I'm trying to teach myself to just sit in the fluidity without judging. And so instead of just saying, this is bad, this is good, I'm messing this up, I should be, to be a little calmer in the fluidity. And sort of to detach a bit from the emotions and detach a bit from your regret about the past or your fear about the future, and just watch it and so approximately on average over time, my life is going to be better if I build that muscle of meditation and calm and equanimity to learn to sit within the fluidity, this changing world, without trying to cling to things and be like, no, but I want the world to stay this way, or what if the world goes this way? Just to sit and be like, okay, whatever happens, I'm going to take control of my internal equanimity as much as possible. So again, that's like all of these things, it's simple, not easy.
Yes.
We know that we have to build inner equanimity. We know we have to be kinder. We know we have to be more loving, but it's simple, not easy. But one of the great ideas that comes from Tom Gaynor in this book is that you want to be directionally correct. And so it's not that you have to be optimal, but if you're directionally correct and you keep plugging away over many years, Tom's assertion to me, which had a big effect on me, is that if you're consistent doing with these good principles, whether it's exercise, diet, patient investing, buying things at a discount, and then just being disciplined and owning them over time. He said he was never number one at anything. He was never the best at anything he did. But he said, after about 30 years, he's like, I turned out to be number one-ish, because so many people fell by the wayside who were in a hurry or were doing stupid, self-destructive stuff. And so this is one of the great truths of life, I think, is it's getting all of these little things right, and then plugging away over time. So I have trouble controlling my weight, and I would always look at these skinny people that I would go out for dinner with, and I'd be like, how come he's eating salad? He's so thin. He's already so thin. And I feel like I'm having the extra bread roll. It's like, well, that's why, because it's the little decision that compounds over time. So you want to find lots of good habits in life that compound over time.
Yes.
So it's not doing one act of charity that's so big that everyone's going to say, oh, you're so wonderful. It's like, try to be kinder, try to be more generous. And you do that over many years. And you look back and you're like, God, that's kind of amazing. I'm so happy with all of the people I've helped in the course of my life. And I see that with Arnold Vandenberg, that's why I ended the book with Arnold, where he looks, I don't want to ruin the ending for anyone if we haven't got there at the moment, but he just looks at the number of people he's helped in his life, and he says, nobody can take that away from me. If I lost all of my money,
yes,
I'm surrounded by these letters from people who I've helped over life. And that's just an amazing thing. Like, I can see his happiness there. And there was a wonderful moment where I was in his office in Texas, and forgive me for being long-winded, because I know it means we don't get so many questions, but there was a moment where I was in Texas with him, and he had adopted his son, who was a son from his wife's first marriage.
yes.
And the son had been this kind of weak, slightly shy, slightly scared 5-year-old, I think, when Arnold had adopted him decades ago, many years ago. And I think he'd been kind of like the first father, the biological father had left the family. And so he was this little lonely, lost kid. And Arnold, who had spent his childhood in an orphanage during the Holocaust, takes this little kid under his wing and becomes his coach in athletics. And he makes him this shot put champion, partly by, this kid who's like 5'9" at his absolute peak. And he's beating these people who are like 6'7" and winning state championships, partly because Arnold coaches him so much, and partly because Arnold hypnotized him constantly. So he even won an event when his leg was in a cast because he was hypnotized. I mean, it's an amazing thing. And Arnold takes out this booklet with all of these clippings from newspapers describing his son's success as an athlete. And he starts to choke up. And so here's this 80-something-year-old guy basically crying. And I said, why is this so emotional to you? And he says, because I remember what he was like, and to have transformed this kid's life. And what's amazing, there was a point when his son is president of Vandenberg's company, so they work together every day. And at a certain point, I think when he turned 18, he said, I'm going to change my name to Vandenberg. I want your name. And Arnold said, no, you can't do that because your biological father would be offended and it would be hurtful to him. And he's like, no, you don't have any choice. I want your name. And that's really lovely to see this relationship between Arnold and his son. And it's not his stepson, even though he is his stepson. It's like they love each other. And so think of the journey that Arnold has gone through as this guy who went through the Holocaust, who was in an orphanage, who was in hiding as a child, who was malnourished. And he looks back now in his 80s, and he's surrounded by people who love him. He's had this extraordinary second marriage to this incredible woman, Eileen, for the last 50 years, who's taken incredible care of him. It's just this very loving, extraordinary woman. And so I look at that and I think, that's a successful life. That's somebody who took a terrible hand, malnourished, physically abused by his father, who used to beat him up when he was a kid, lost 39 family members during the Holocaust, was full of rage, messed up his first marriage because, he just wasn't in good shape by then emotionally. He was still traumatized by the Holocaust. And his wife ran off with someone else. And so he's full of rage and anger. And now you look at him as this 80-something-year-old man, and he's so full of love and kindness and joy and enthusiasm and a desire to help. And I look at that and I think, that's what I really want to clone. That's that's someone who's profoundly rich, and
Def-
and it's not to do with money.
Mm.
And so we want to play the game and become financially independent, but we don't, and secure, and not have worries about bills, and have the freedom to send our kids to great schools and the like. But you don't want to get so fixated on the money that you lose sight of what it's actually for. And so when I see someone like Arnold or someone like Monish sharing the money, using it to lift up other people, focusing on their relationships, it gives you a profound clue as to what works in life.
Definitely, that is so beautiful, Williams, and will definitely imbibe in our life. It's a lovely inspiration from you.
Thanks.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for sharing, William. In fact, you answered my question about why Arnold is your favorite, as you mentioned in the book.
Yeah,
and
remarkable man.
yes, we wish we could go on with this absolutely enthralling and nourishing session, but we respect your time. Thank you so much, firstly, for writing this profound book and gracing our forum. And before we go for the vote of thanks, I would like to request all the members to pose with the book for a picture. So we all have this book and we have the author with us. So what else do we want?
Oh, that's wonderful. Will you take a screenshot, someone that you can send to me? That's a lovely thing to see.
Absolutely. I will share that with you, William. Can we have Anjali, can you please take a screenshot? Are you ready?
That's lovely. I'll tell you one other thing that I think is very profound on this question of happiness, before I forget, is you look at Ed Thorpe, who's one of the greatest game players of all time. And here's a guy who didn't have a losing quarter in his hedge fund for 20 years, and he figured out how to win at blackjack. He invented card counting. It was absolute genius. And when I asked him, if you were approaching life as a game, what would you do? How do you win the game of life? One of the things he said to me is, who you spend your time with is probably the most important thing of all. And I thought that was a very telling insight, that ultimately it comes down to relationships. That's ultimately what's going to make the biggest difference to your life. So I don't diminish the importance of money. I've been in a situation before where I was scared, where I lost my job in the middle of the financial crisis. And I thought, what if I can't support my kids? And it was terrifying. And luckily everything worked out well, and I didn't have any debt, and I had set myself up so that I would be fine. So I didn't even have to sell any stocks. So I don't diminish the importance of money and financial security and independence. And I think particularly for women, if you read great literature, which I do a lot, if you read 19th century literature, you read Jane Austen or Dickens or any of these great novelists, there are always women in terrible positions because they don't have control over their money. You see it if you read Tolstoy, Dostoevsky. It's all full of stories of women who don't have what these money managers would call optionality, because they don't have financial independence. And so I don't diminish the importance of money. It's colossally important. You want to have that protection, but knowing that the thing that ultimately you're going to look back on and say that made for a good life, knowing that that's relationships, makes a huge difference. Because then, for example, yesterday, my daughter said to me, and I know we're running out of time, so I'll let you go. But my daughter said to me yesterday, I'm going back to college tomorrow. Are you sure you don't want to go out and have ice cream with me? And I'm like, I have so many work obligations. I'm like, yeah, how can I deny that? And so I went and I got ice cream with her, and we sat on a deck overlooking the Hudson River here in New York. And, I was stressed out and it was kind of hard for me to relax, but it's like, what could be more important than sitting there with my 21-year-old daughter? And so just knowing that's actually something that I've consciously cloned from The Greatest Investors. And so when you find an idea in the book that resonates for you, internalize it and make it a part of your life. Like if you find something like that, like compounding goodwill or sharing more or deferring gratification or compounding good habits, it's not about doing everything in the book. And I'm not saying this because the book is so great. It's like I'm just synthesizing great ideas from a lot of very powerful thinkers. But when you find something that really helps you, go big on it. Make it a part of your life, because it's that consistency of taking a few very powerful principles and making it a part of your life that when you look back in 10, 20, 30, 40 years, you'll see that it gave you an overwhelming benefit, an overwhelming competitive advantage to just apply these powerful principles again and again. And you look at Warren and Charlie, and you can see what it does over an enormously long period, not just financially, but the fact that they're surrounded by so many decent, honorable people who think well of them. It's an incredible thing. So you've seen the power of compounding, not only of money, but of good habits. You've seen them become better and better people. That's an amazing thing. So
absolutely, William.
So
thank you so
that's
much
my
for
answer to a question you didn't ask. But I'm sorry to everyone who didn't get to answer questions. This is part of the problem of me being so long-winded.
No, it was a wonderful session, William. Thank you once again. And I would now like to invite Nidhi Kenoy, from our Mumbai chapter president, to give a VOT.
Thank you.
A very good evening to everyone, and good morning, Mr. Green, our esteemed speaker. It's indeed a privilege to be here, and on behalf of the Millennium Mams family, I would like to extend my gratitude to you for making this such a super session. I would like to propose a hearty vote of thanks to you for accepting our invitation and being here and spending this early morning for you with us. And thank you so much, William, for the simplicity like you've displayed, marrying spirituality with success. All your thoughts, they've really inspired us. And I would like to express our gratitude to our mentors, Mr. Dhanuka and Mr. Bhavania, for encouraging and motivating us. So Dhanuka, his dedication towards helping us achieve our true potential is really, really astounding. Thank you. And thank you once again, William. Thank you for doing that.
Thank you so much. And I haven't had a chance to look at all of the chats, but I saw someone said, can we write to William? And if any, feel free to contact me. I'm on Twitter at William Green 72. I'm on LinkedIn. Feel free to connect with me. My email is wsmgreen@gmail.com. I'm a little overwhelmed with messages some of the time. And so I always have this sense that I'm failing to get back to people and offending people mortally. So I do try to respond, but I don't always get to it. But please feel free to stay in contact. And it's just been a real pleasure to talk to you. And it's been delightful. And I really admire what you're doing with Millennium Mams. And I think what I love is that you're studying such great principles from people like Warren and Charlie, and you're teaching these great principles, and it's going to radiate out in this incredible way. You'll see the benefits to so many people, and so it's a beautiful thing. You're creating this kind of incredible effect as the benefits of your wisdom and good behavior and long-term behavior and the like. It'll radiate out and benefit so many people. So I wish you much success.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you so much, William.
Thank you.
Thank you.